And so in this state, Abraham, his will knew what his head did not. Like we mentioned with the Magi and the star, their will knew what their head did not. And that's the first position you find yourself in, is that you begin to feel these drawings. Abraham goes without knowing what the future holds, even knowing what the plan is. And that's what we have to have the courage to do, and what the gift of the nativity is. Everyone, don't forget to join the Greenwood Fellowship on my website. It's incredibly rewarding and beneficial to have a walled garden of other serious people on this path of initiation, to share experience and wisdom together as we all progress. You'll have access to membership videos, the second half of all lectures and streams, monthly think tanks with senior members, senior group streams on our YouTube, and soon in-person events, conferences and meetups. Please join the fellowship. The Magi's star. So on Christmas, the nativity, what does it show? It actually shows two different types of revelation, but also the nativity shows what happens when Christ becomes present, the threat that happens, the murder of the firstborn, the anti-revelatory principle also becomes active that you have to be wary of. And so how does this relate to initiation? How does this relate to the Christ child being born in you? Well, or intuition for that matter. Well, you see it described in the way Revelation appears to the shepherds of Bethlehem and the Magi. These are two different types of revelation. One is the communication of forces, where what I've talked about previously is as spiritual touch, like a gravity pushing you in a direction, but also felt behind the eyes. It has the immediacy of touch, but also as something in active imagination, as I've talked about before too. The star of Bethlehem is a very real thing that you can see. And so this is, it's not a guiding and teaching though. Again, these are different types. I would say that it's subjectively preferable to have the second type, which is what the shepherds of Bethlehem experience, which is they're also taught and given specifics about the location of where the child's born, where Christ is born, and the like. That's teaching and guiding. That's the other type of revelatory experience. That's subjectively preferable, but objectively, they're the same. But in the Magi's sense, what that does is that it leaves the work beyond the forces that are granted and that direction. It leaves the work of the intellect to, it leaves the work to figure out the details in the intellect, to work it out. So they're the difference between the two types of revelation in that sense. And so that's connected to intuition and what you're developing if you've been doing these practices throughout the year. But Christmas is a very special time for Christian hermeticists. It's a special time for all Christians, of course, but it's a special time for the birth of the seeds of these faculties, the seeds of revelatory faculties. It's an important time for that. And so again, if anyone is involved in this sort of stuff, pray for it at this time, for help and for a spiritual progress, so he can be born in you. Though of course you need to have preparation, which we'll go into in terms of explaining what intuition is. So that's basically what we're talking about today. We'll do the best we can because I am feeling a bit tired. Again, doing the stream at this time is a bit odd, but I wanted to make sure I got it to you. for Christmas tomorrow. And when we are talking about intuition, what it is, or what you can think about it, is the divine call. And then you've got the symbol here of the hanged man. So think about Abraham. He was given the divine call. This is signified here by the symbol where the legs are faced in the sky and the head, which you symbolizes the intellect, and the hands are with the earth, right? That's the state we're in when we're doing these practices, when we're starting to withdraw. Obedience is required. Abraham was already, as a prerequisite, in the state of obedience, meaning he is obedient to solar law, obedient to revelation, the Ten Commandments. As an example of what revelation is, obedient to revelation. That is a prerequisite. What does that mean? It means the will, through prayer and through that stuff, the will, the wish, which comes first for any of this stuff, which comes first before the cave. You can have access to the cave. The will, that's what prayer allows. The will begins to, which the feet symbolize, because the feet are, the appendages are the currents of the will. That's why they're in the sky. And so in the case of intuition, once this has been established, if you have established through prayer and all the practices I talk about and obedience, your will moves towards where the eternal, where the Lord is. And so in this state, Abraham, his will knew what his head did not. Like we mentioned with the Magi and the star, their will knew what their head did not. And that's the first position you find yourself in, is that you begin to feel these drawings, because the will knows. But you have to have faith. You have to accept the call, because you'll have the impetus and even the certainty. This is what happens throughout this process of initiation, is you have the certainty. And so did the Magi. They had the certainty already to follow it. It comes with infused certainty. They just don't know it in the intellect yet. There's this separation between the intellect and where this other part of you is, this deeper part of you is. And so Abraham goes without knowing what the future holds, even knowing what the plan is. And that's what we have to have the courage to do. And what the gift of the nativity is. And what we should pray for. It's a wonderful thing. It's a tough thing, but it's a wonderful thing when the certainty comes. But it only comes through action, because the will isn't naturally a faculty of sensing. You have to keep doing. The Magi are moving around. They're going places. So is Abraham. That allows for the communications to continue. And so it's almost like you've got a movement. And throughout that, given that you're doing the practices of the religion and all that's involved in that, the knowing space that you are as intellect can begin to catch up to the will that is with the Lord and know. The will has its own kind of knowing that you don't know, because it's deep in the ground. It has its own understanding, which was where this certainty comes from, that the martyr has. The martyr has that certainty. It's a gift. It's the gift of faith. Again, it's not a rationality thing. It's infused. It's the gift. It's the Christ child having been born in you. And so, but throughout the process, and especially in Christian Hermeticism, the knowing is to catch up with the will. And so as you communicate more and more and more with conscience through intuition, which we'll talk more about as we go forward. But the key lesson from the Magi is to, again, the thinking serpent, the calculative serpent wants to check with Herod and his people, wants to check scientism for confirmation rather than follow the revelation that's given, the revelatory action, the divine call that's sent as intuition. And when you first start to experience the spiritual touch and the various faculties, that's the temptation there. The intellect tries to explain it away, you know? And so the key lesson of this is to follow the star that's born on Christmas. And hopefully will be born with you too. Do not consult Herod, the Jays, and do not consult Herod and his people. Do not consult scientism. Follow it's hard to do it first, but you have to follow this gift that you're given. But luckily the Lord provides more and more certainty, and you pray for that certainty. You pray for that certainty. For hope, charity, love, certainty. And the truth. Of course, the primary thing we must be doing throughout all this stuff is seeking the truth. Because if you seek other stuff, you know what happens. If you seek joy or spiritual experience for its own sake, you'll be deceived. But intuition is becoming. It is transformation. It's moving from a mode of intellect which harvests and takes to a mode of sowing, from reaping to sowing, going down to the depths of things. The space that you are is a kind of is. What is? What is? It's a end state of everything, facticity. The way it looks to you, it's finished, it's complete. And everything you do is trying to achieve something, to take. That's what the intellect does. It's looking for end products. This and the Lord, the Word at the ground of you is the springtime. Eternally the springtime. Is this becoming? It's a process, not an end. And so you are it is in a sense also an end though, in that you're moving towards your transcendent self. You're moving towards the Lord. That becoming is at the depths of being, of your being. But in terms of the experience of intuition, I've talked about it before in terms of practical intuition, which is the good, which is also the way, as in the way, truth, and life, which is a feeling. It's a feeling which is called practical, is the feeling for the good. Again, you only know to these things once they begin to occur. Then you go, oh, that's what Scott's talking about. So it was the same for me. And then there's moral intuition, which is related to the life and beauty, which is the feeling for beauty or feeling for the life. And then there's intellectual intuition, which is the feeling for the truth. But in terms of the actual process of becoming, because you're leaving this state of dead intellect, which again, Christmas is about the start of this, the birth of Christ in the depths of the soul. Vision, inspiration, intuition. This is related to sweat, tears, and blood. So what is vision? Vision is experience of revelatory facts. It's active imagination, as I've talked about, perhaps symbolic. But what it speaks to is a passiveness, is that you go through the sweat of having to reach a certain level of intensity for to bear the vision, let's say. And not everyone has all these things. Some people only have one. They all eventually lead to the full transformation, though, if that makes sense. Well, it will when it starts occurring. And so you're passive when you're doing that, when that comes about. Now, what about inspiration? You know that by the feeling, again, it's the fire of Emmaus, it's the heart, the burning heart. In your concentration practices, for instance, you'll notice what I call the airport feeling. It's the sorrow-laced joy. That is I guess you could call it a symptom of you being inspired by the divine. And so that's why that's tears. It's the gift of tears. And when that's occurring, you're active at the same time as passive. Again, this is to do with the practices, but we're just talking about 3 different types of experience related to intuition. It's hard to understand when you haven't experienced any of it. But if you've watched some of these streams before, you'll sort of know what we're talking about. And again, this all relates to Christmas. Because what we're trying to birth is the very first pangs, the very first experiences of intuition, which is also spiritual touch. Primarily, every time you feel the movements of spiritual touch, which I've talked about before, which begins sort of behind the eyes. Again, you're not going to know this until you start to experience it. That's always signifying a becoming, a transformation at the ground of your being, even in the tiniest ways, to complete the full transformation. And what's happening? You're being transformed from a modern technical being, of a technical intellect, of the intellect of the serpent and the fall, into will to good, into love, into becoming a will to service of him, not a will to power, trying to grasp things and take in the world. That's the becoming that's happening. But who else are you becoming? You're becoming your guardian angel. You're becoming your angel, your transcendent self. And as you progress further on, you're becoming Christ. That's how it works. And the tradition, of course, calls it purification, illumination, union. That's what the saints go through. And so the mystery of the blood is intuition. It's kind of hard to describe what that feels like from phenomenologically. But it's related to, of course, Christ's blood is love. And so moving from an active passive state of inspiration, when you're continuing your prayer and attending, you're getting closer and closer, and the depth of feeling of the spiritual touch gets more and more. It's almost like your face is squished up against someone that you love. And the fire of that love becomes more and more and more, and that also laced with sorrow. But actually, the sorrow sort of becomes less. Again, this is all unseen. It's uncreated. That's what you're interacting with. And so eventually that ends up being passive as well. You're no longer active because you're becoming the thing that you're concentrating on. But I don't want to go into too much more detail into that. But yeah, you become passive. And of course, this whole thing is about becoming that cave, it's the sacrificing of the low, worldly, empirical subject that lusts after things and sex and things in the world and all the sins, which the whole Christian experience is about moving on from, to become That's what it is. That's the Christian life, is intuition. It's becoming and a transformation. It's just the intuition is the intermediary thing that leads to that transformation. Again, this isn't diverged from Christian experience. It's also connected with philosophy. When Henry Bergson talks about intuition, awaken through sympathy. Sympathy is a divine faculty, or better called love. Love is a divine faculty. The intellect can leave its milieu and plunge into the depths outside of what it knows that it's grasped and taken through this loving all, loving the hierarchies, loving God, loving neighbor, loving nature. And this is what Rudolf Steiner talks about. This is what the initiates talk about. It's what the saints talk about. And so intuition, you could say that it begins with, if we want to just refer to it like the unconscious, it begins with your intellect in your state as the low empirical subject. You begin in the only way that the Lord can communicate with you, or your angel can communicate with you, is in dreams, because you're so obsessed with whatever you're doing. And so as you begin this process, then it becomes more possible to communicate with you in the waking state through symbolism, sent in active imagination. That becomes possible. Again, the star is actually a thing that you are able to see later on. The Star of Bethlehem is a real phenomena that's connected with spiritual touch and these things. So that's why it's so appropriate to talk about intuition, because it is, the Star of Bethlehem is connected with it. So, and from there, again, like I said, knowledge begins to catch up to where the will is, because the will is with the divine. Will's coming first because you're actively choosing God in your free will. It's not a matter of predestination. It's that you're actively choosing. And that's why the will is first. In this case, that's what we're trying to do, to make the decisions so the Christ child can be born, so the nativity can happen. It's not it's not just a predestined grace like the Calvinists and the Lutherans. I think the Lutherans think that as well. Can't remember. It's not a matter only of grace. It's effort and grace. Of course, it's not brought about by you like the yogis would think. It's not like a technique. It's always a collaborative, active, passive. But you can choose him freely for him to be born. It's his decision in the final analysis, though. It's his decision. But of course, if you do all the things and you de-technicalize and you become truly human, which means to move towards being divine, which means to love, and to love not just your family, is to love beyond, to will good beyond, to all. You can't, there's no way of awakening these things unless you have a loving heart, unless you will good. Will good's an easier way to talk about it. Unless you will good to beyond your family, beyond your selfish interests. It has to be. That's just how it is. In fact, it's dangerous if you don't. Very dangerous. Yeah. And so intuition then moves from that communication stage where into a closer and closer and closer union until you are united. That's becoming God. But of course, that doesn't happen. That final resurrection of you, resurrected by love because you've become a loving heart, doesn't happen until you've gone through the long crucifixion of the thought, feeling, and the will of your faculties. Have been crucified through the 3 O's, through poverty. Again, concentration without effort is a poverty of thought. You're bowing your head every morning by doing that. Your prayers, meditative prayers, which is what I'm talking about with the withdrawal. That is, you're bowing your head on your side of it anyway. You're bowing your head, lowering the intellect. Not completely, but away from the world, turning towards him. You transform in doing that over time. In fact, it practices all three, but that doesn't mean you have to live the Christian life outside of it, of course. You have to forgive. You have to do all the practices I mentioned last time. But that communication gets closer and closer and closer, but it takes a long time. So that's another thing. But I pray often, and you should pray this Christmas for the very beginning of it, to be born anew, so you can, well, again, you have to, it's not going to happen without your obedience, without these different things, you beginning and making an effort and making an active decision by praying, by doing these things, putting your will in the right place. But pray for it. Choose him freely. But yeah, more on intuition. And you can see here, you can see here even symbolically, I'm talking about the transcendent self. It is a kind, you can see why they're children in that symbol here of the sun in the tarot, is because it is like that. You become more and more childlike because of your love, because you've become wooden, you've become mechanized and jaded and cynical through, like Solomon. Solomon is the opposite of Abraham. Solomon is the autumn of the intellect. Solomon is all the intellectualizing of the wisdom of a past age and talking about it. There's nothing new under the sun, as he says. He's articulating there the eternal return and also his desire for a deep yearning, as the whole earth yearned for the salvation of the birth of the Savior. But he was a reaper of everything that had been before. Abraham was a sower, as I said. And so I think I've talked about pretty much most of that there. But I might as well just articulate, because there's some good articulations here of what vision is: a revelation of facts of experience. Inspiration is the revelation of understanding and knowing, which is what comes, what's infused with inspiration. Again, it's signified by that sorrow and joy, which is the death and life, which is also connected how you know partly that it's true, because it's not, you're not seeking joy and having joy granted to you in delusion, because it's sorrowful as well. But yeah, it comes with infused knowledge. So a big thank you to all our members, contributors, producers who you see here in this plaque of honor. Without your financial help, this fellowship wouldn't be possible at all.